everyone, and welcome to this week's Wednesday Wisdom. We are delighted today to be joined by Dr. Roger Bretherton. Hello, Roger.
Hello, Jason. Good to be with you.
Roger, why don't you start by just telling us a bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, so I am a psychologist. I work at the University of Lincoln, and I study some pretty cool stuff, really. So my sort of area of expertise is the study of what psychologists would call character strengths, but which I think most Christians would call fruit of the Spirit, which is sort of I study the psychology of love, of hope, of humility, of kindness, of wisdom, Wednesday wisdom in this case, and look at it in kind of lots of different ways. So look at it sort of scientifically. Most people don't realize there is a huge kind of field industry around sort of studying those. How do we define them? How do we develop love, wisdom, whatever? And then work with lots of organizations with that as well. So, you know, some weeks I'll be working with a charity. Next week I'll be working with an international bank, talking about these positive qualities of character and what they do for us. And then, of course, the whole church thing is there for me too, as well, in terms of it's a theological understanding of it. So even though I'm not always necessarily mentioning Jesus in some of those audiences, kind of the biblical understanding and the life of God always lies behind everything I'm doing. So that makes me a weird psychologist, to be honest. You know, a psychologist who's sort of really trying to dance between the science and the practice and the theology and just work out how all that works. But it's a really, really good, fun kind of world to live in.
That's great. And do you want to tell us a bit about your character course that you've written while we're kind of on that topic?
Yeah, well, so I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I've literally just got the data through on the character course. So I wrote a couple of years back, I got funding from the John Templeton Foundation to develop a course for church-based small groups that effectively takes 8 of those character strengths that I talk about. So it takes learning, which is really discipleship, hope, love, forgiveness, gratitude. This is where I get lost. Humor, persistence, and curiosity. Curiosity is like seeking, pursuing God. And basically has 8 sessions. It's all free online. So you get a video, leaders' notes, handouts, exercises to try in the week. So there's 8 sessions. It's at www.thecharactercourse.com, and it can all be downloaded and used however you like. But for our research project, we ran it with about 1,000 people in church across the UK, and basically just looked at what changed in people as a result of doing the course. And what we found is over 8 weeks, not as much change as I would like it to change. So things like, were people more aware of God? No, they weren't. Did they have a deeper relationship with Jesus? Not according to our sample, they didn't. But the one thing that really did change, and actually this is one of the things that you can measure changing quite quickly, it is that people said that their levels of positive emotion had gone up as a result of doing the course. And even more interesting, when you divide the people who did the course between those who attended and those who practiced, you know, so everybody attended pretty much. So people who just attended the group versus those who picked up the practices of love, of hope, forgiveness, whatever, and used them every day while they were doing the course. There's a massive difference between those 2 groups of people. So it's the people who kind of not just did the learning, but then went on to practice it, see a huge spike in positive emotion. And positive emotion is hope and gratitude and serenity, peace, etc. And although that doesn't sound like much, positive emotion is really, really important psychologically, because positive emotion actually ripples through social networks. So if you're feeling loving today, Jason, not only do I benefit from that, well, firstly, you benefit from that. It does you a lot of good, healthily and psychology-wise. It does me good. But then whoever I meet next might also get that, and whoever they meet next might also get that. And so positive emotions like love, peace, hope, gratitude is sometimes included as a positive emotion, ripple through social space and actually lead to really, really concrete changes in situations. So even though we're like, the only thing we found was people's positive emotion went up as a result of doing this program, that's actually pretty important. And when you look biblically, it does seem to be that it's positive emotions like peace, like joy, like love, like gratitude. They're not just emotions, but that's kind of what they are. they really are the kind of signs that God is doing something in our lives. When those things are there and they're high, that's kind of the sign that God is there and doing something. So yeah, so that's the character course, www.thecharactercourse.com, and you can download it all and watch the videos and do whatever you like with it from there.
Great. Oh, well, that's brilliant, Roger. And I hope that people can give that a try and give that a try in their small groups, and see some positive emotion rise. That would be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah, sorry, that was a much longer explanation than I intended to give it. Just went on, didn't it? But there you go. Yeah.
Absolutely fine. It's a very good thing. So we're happy to endorse it for you. So today, Roger, we were going to talk a bit about this thing called Dunbar's number. Do you want to explain to us what that is and a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so well, this is a really sort of weird project that I got invited to be part of, and it was being run by universities that are much posher than the University of Lincoln, so kind of Oxford and Cambridge and Coventry universities were running this project called Religion and the Social Brain, and it was basically the idea of this project, and I was just a very small part of the project, but it was looking at a particular theory. Called the social brain hypothesis, and how this might apply to religious groups, because it hasn't really been applied to sort of faith before, really, or at least not in the way that we applied it. And to put the theory really simple, it's sometimes called Dunbar's number. It's basically the idea that you can tell, if you look at humans and you look at lots of other species of animals, you can tell what kind of size of group they end up belonging to by just looking at the size of their brain. Like there's this clear association between how big an organism's brain is and how big its social group is. And so when you look at the human brain in comparison, say, to chimpanzees or apes or things like that, the human brain seems to be designed for the widest possible kind of group is about 150 people, give or take a little bit here and there. It basically that's the number of people in which you can both know and be known. In other words, they can care for you and you can care for them. But it's a little bit more complex than that, because actually when you start to look at the theory, it's not just one number. So that number 150 is often called Dunbar's number, but actually when you start to look at it, then there's different qualities of relationships at different levels of groups. So usually have a kind of relationship of one with someone who's very special, and then a relationship of about 5 people with people who are very close to you, and then 15 is kind of like sort of extended-ish family sort of group you might belong to, and then 50 is sort of your tribal group, and then 150 is actually the sort of limit at which your ability to really know and like people sort of, goes missing beyond 150, basically. So it's actually a series of numbers. And just getting back to our project, so basically what I was asked to do as part of this project was to go around loads of churches and gather their data, like gather their attendance figures and all this kind of thing, and their growth figures. And we did this with churches all over the UK, and basically try and see if that kind of pattern repeated itself in church growth. And so that's what I ended up doing. Basically, that's kind of what Dunbar's number is, and that's how we sort of applied it in that project.
Great. What did you find? Does it repeat itself in church?
It does. So here's the really weird thing is, so back in the 1970s, there's this sort of researcher called David Wasdell, and he did this research where he was looking at Anglican parishes. So he's looking at kind of vicars in sort of churches in the Anglican parish, and basically what he found was it didn't matter how big the parish was, i.e. how many people there were living in the parish. You could have a parish of 20,000 people or one of 2,000. If you just had one vicar, the maximum size of your church always stuck at the same figure. And the figure he came up with was 168. So it's like, this is the figure it always stops at. And so he started saying, basically, and Dunbar's number didn't exist, this theory didn't exist in those days, so he had no idea really what he was talking about. But he said it does seem to me that the church has some kind of absolute limit to which it can grow if it only has one leader. Mm-hmm. And he said it's kind of like cabbages. Cabbages, they can get bigger and bigger, but there is an absolute limit to how big a cabbage can be. And he says with churches, it seems to be round about this sort of 150, 160 kind of mark. And then when you skip over into all the church growth literature, you find a lot of them start talking about what they call the transition zone at 150. So there's churches that have been tracked for decades and decades and decades, like 30, 40 years, and they bounce up and down and in and around this 150 mark for lots of different reasons. And so basically what we kind of really discovered is that 150 does seem to be this, you have to add and take a bit from that, but does seem to be a sort of place where churches that want to grow get stuck. It does seem to be a sort of natural limit. One person put it like this. They said above 150 church members start looking at newcomers like, as enemies, almost like we don't want anybody else coming in here anymore because we can't cope with anymore. So basically we found that it does seem to apply in churches. And just to say where I think that's really useful for church leaders is that they begin to realize that there's a certain point where a lot of church leaders start to get very stressed, and it's around about somewhere between 100 and 150. Suddenly things that felt quite easy become much, much harder. And what Dunbar's number says is, it says that's not just you doing a bad job, it's not just you having a bad day, it's not that you've failed in some way, it's actually that as human beings we're sort of biologically designed to deal with a certain number of people. And once we start pushing that, we have to do something else to manage it all.
Great. So one question we've got here, Roger, is, so there are different qualities of relationship in groups of different sizes. Is that a biblical concept?
Oh, that is a good question. So here's the thing. So we got Robin Dunbar, who came up with Dunbar's number. And, he's a very high-flying, leading Oxford psychologist. So his theory is really, really famous and it's everywhere. And I sat down with him and just started to talk through how, if you look in the Bible, those kind of concentric circles that he talks about around people, I said, you do know that that's kind of the way Jesus organized himself as well. So you have the 1, and then you have the 3, and then you have the 12, and then you have the 70, and then you have the 120. And he'd never heard any of that. He'd never heard of those kind of concentric circles around Jesus. You also see a bit of it with Moses as well, in terms of organizing the Israelites into groups of 50s and 100s to make them more manageable. So there is this sort of, you can see this idea in the Bible in the way that Jesus particularly, you could say he organized the first church, if you like, the way he organized that first grouping of people, where beyond the 120 or so, you then end up with the crowd, really, the thousands beyond that. And so I think actually those kind of different sort of levels of relationship and at each level of relationship, what happens is you get a slight dilution, so the slight dilution of the quality of the relationship to add more people into it. So you relate really differently to your 1 than you do to your 3, than you do to your 12, than you do to your 70. That there's a slight dilution of relationship, but nevertheless a greater sense of kind of vision and investment in something bigger together.
That's really good, Roger. It's really, really interesting research, isn't it? So I guess kind of coming from where we're at as a network, we've got some churches that be kind of a bit smaller, around the sort of 50 mark. We've got some probably quite a lot around the kind of 100 figure, and then some larger churches as well kind of above that. How do you think this kind of, given that it suggests 150 is the maximum size for a human being, what do you think the advantages are for both smaller and larger churches, and how this kind of research applies to them?
Well, it's a really, really kind of good way of thinking about it, because what it does, it allows you to think about what the relative costs and benefits are of different sizes of church, really, and what the quality of them is going to be like. And the other thing to say is, it's not as if this research is saying that one size is better than another. Like, they all just have these slightly different dynamics, and they have to be led in slightly different ways. And that's what it tells us. And it tells us that that's not our fault. That's just a natural part of being human. So it kind of says, in the same way that not all of us can run a 3-minute mile or whatever it is that we want to do. We equally, there's limits to how many people we can cope with as well. So what it means, for example, so if you have like a church of like 10, 15 people, it will feel very much like a family. Everybody knows each other's business, very, very close community. Sometimes it will struggle to get bigger than that. In a group of 15, for example, everybody can contribute. So everyone can bring their piece. You don't need a lot of organization because there isn't a lot to organize. It kind of self-organizes itself. It's like a family gathering, really. It gets on, it does its thing. But then once you get to a group, once you go above that and you start thinking about groups that are going up to the 50 level, very often you find those are the groups where the pastor kind of becomes the central figure. They start to become the organizer. They have to do a lot of work to make it all work, because a group of 50, rather than, you can't focus on each other in quite the same way anymore, and you can't read everybody in quite the same way that allows you to self-organize. So the pastor ends up being almost like this air traffic controller who has to coordinate everything to make it work. And then when you get above 50, weirdly, the whole thing reverses again. So in a church of, 100 to 150, the pastor then really, really needs to delegate in order to get people to do stuff. So suddenly you go back to, actually, we now need a sort of, there's almost like a 15 people at the center of a church of 150 who are sort of helping to make it work, even if they're just putting in bits and pieces to make it work. But then the big shift, I think, for most people comes above the 150 line, and that's often viewed as a ceiling in church. Like if your view is our church has to be big, then that feels like the ceiling. If that doesn't bother you, it doesn't really matter very much, does it? But to get over that ceiling, you actually have to then almost create a series of subcultures within the church. So if you've been in a very big church, you know that not everybody knows one another. And actually what happens is you end up with lots of sort of mini groups of like kind of 50 to 100 people, the worship people and the young parents with kids and the older adults and the young professionals, the students, all these kind of different sort of subcultures develop. Because our brains just can't cope with a room of 300 to 500 people. We're just not able to really kind of make sense of that. So this is why it kind of back in the day, people would say, before the sort of mega church movement came along, that the more traditional British way of doing it was to plant and plant and plant and plant. So once you got roughly around 100, 150 people, you would plant another church over and over and over and over again. In order to maintain that sort of quality of relationship in the church.
Great. And do you think that structure still looks the same today? Do you think that is the mechanism that we go into when we get to 150? Or do you think, obviously we've got many churches now that are multi-site. How do you think that looks today?
Well, I suppose the multi-site model really is basically creating kind of smaller groups, isn't it? Like trying to say we want to get to be thousands of people. So when you get to really, really big numbers of people, they are held together by common vision, common experience, common sense of purpose. That's what draws people into it. You also actually need sort of bigger sense of inspiration in worship as well. So believe it or not, one of the pieces of research we were doing on religion and the social brain was that we had people going into sort of charismatic worship services and videoing people worshiping from behind, because we weren't allowed to identify them, and then measuring their endorphin release. In other words, how many feel-good hormones do you have in worship? And basically part of the hypothesis was that in a group that was bigger than 150, one of the things that holds you together is just that feel-good factor of feeling really good connections with God in those kind of situations. It was quite an entertaining part of the project. But I do think it still applies in our context too.
Great. Oh, that's really good, Roger. And so obviously one church that's restructured recently in the network is Alive into these smaller communities of 100 and 150, well, 120 to 150 each. What do you think kind of this transition period they're in at the moment, like, give us some examples of how that might be working for people? What will people be feeling in that change? And I think really it applies to any kind of church planting, isn't it? When you kind of separate an existing group of people, what happens to people when you do that? What are people likely to gain? What are people likely to lose? How are people likely to feel?
Yeah, that's right. So it has real gains and some losses as well. So we always have to keep that in mind, that both those things will be going on in that kind of context. So let's start with the gain, because obviously we're also still in the COVID era, so we're still social distancing, smelling like alcohol wipes, not in any kind of good way whenever we're meeting together. Um, but basically what it means is, firstly, I think people's sense that they can now contribute to something has probably gone up. In other words, in a smaller group of people, you have to give something for it to work, really. So for me, this means I'm suddenly in the band or community in a way that, I never would have been, in the larger thing where I just not up to the standard of musicianship required for that kind of thing. And then there's people helping on the doors, and there's people putting out seats, and there's people setting up and packing down, and people welcoming one another. And so I think generally it leads to a greater sense of mobilization, because you suddenly feel like your contribution is not only welcome, but needed and seen and understood. So when you're part of a really, really big organization, you can contribute to it, but you don't necessarily always feel like your contribution is recognized. That doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't. It's just that you can't notice. It's harder to tell if it is. Whereas in a smaller group of 50 to 150 people, when you give something, whether it's landed well, whether it's worked well. The other thing that happens in a small group of people is it's more difficult to dissociate yourself from people as well. So, like in a large group, you can almost kind of distance yourself from people as they're just part of the crowd. We're just like people who are going to a gig together, or, we're just attenders, if you like. Whereas in a smaller group of people, some of the things I think that are more, I guess, kind of more biblical. So people you don't get on with, you really have to then work at, how do I sort of think about how I relate to these people and how I learn to love them and find a way through. Whereas in a large group of people, you can avoid them and talk to somebody else. I think also kind of that sense of it's harder to distance yourself from other people in a way of saying that's them and this is me. You're either part of it or you're not. Then in terms of losses, the losses are quite interesting in that so one of the things that a really big group of people can do that a smaller group can't do in churches, for example, is that the kind of the finance that it takes, for example, for a church to pastor people doesn't rise as quickly as its income does as it accumulates more people. So what that means is a really large church, really large body of people can do much bigger things. It can make a bigger impact on a city. It can do bigger events. It can have more high quality production values and all this kind of stuff in a way that a small group really struggles to do. And so I think what will happen for some people going into a smaller group compared to a larger group is that some of them will miss quality of goodness that you can get, sort of high quality production, visionary, attractive model of church. So some of that sometimes goes a bit missing when you've got a smaller group. But what you gain connection to other people, but you lose a sense of belonging to something big and impressive, but nevertheless a little bit impersonal.
Yeah. And I suppose as well, a lot of churches are thinking now about what church looks like for them in this kind of easing environment. A lot of churches kind of just starting to think about going back to in-person services at the moment. Some have been doing that for some time, kind of as a COVID secure thing. How do you think the way that people are going to interact with each other is going to be different in this next season? Or have you got no idea?
I mean, I don't know, and it's always difficult to predict, isn't it? But let me kind of say, let me start by saying something that sounds a bit negative, but ultimately leaves me quite hopeful. And this isn't just about Ground Level or Alive. This is about churches in general across the UK. Because I know, for example, the Church of England is really, really worried about what happens next, because they had so many sort of rural parishes where they had 10 to 12 people in a little church somewhere, who may not return. So when we go back to meeting and services again, some of those churches, in terms of people actually meeting in them, will be gone. Like they won't exist anymore. Sometimes the Church of England is talking about cutting its numbers of clergy by a third, in the next 5 to 10 years. So, there's some really big impact. And I think We will feel that a little less so because we don't have quite so many nominal people knocking about. You only really come to a ground level church if you really believe in Jesus. There's no social sort of reward for being there if you don't really believe in God. But I think it is highly likely that as we return, we will see a reduction in numbers. So I think there might not be as many people come back as headed out. And I think that will be a little bit worrying to begin with. But I actually think what that will do for us is it will put us in a place where, rather than thinking about how do we maintain this thing and how do we hold on to people and how do we make sure things work together, we just have to get back to how we follow Jesus. What does it mean to be faithful to God in this situation, in this time? And I think if I'm hearing a shift in people I'm talking to and in myself, that's the shift. It's the shift from feeling like we have to maintain this thing and keep it running and keep it going, versus an approach that's saying, actually, we've seen that actually when everything disappears and collapses and we all go online, it's still there. Our faith is still there. Our love of Jesus is still there. Our desire to serve and to follow him still remains. And actually, that's much more solid and much more firm and a much better foundation on which to build who we are than perhaps some of the other things that we felt were essential, but started to look much less essential once we all ended up online.
So in some ways, a bit of a back to basics kind of time, and a time to kind of rebuild some of those relationships and connections.
Yeah, I kind of, that's a good way of putting it. I sort of almost view it a bit like Judah returning after the exile in some ways, where basically it was an opportunity to be refined and a bit more focused. And I think that's the opportunity we have now.
Yeah, that's really great. Well, I hope you've enjoyed joining us for Wednesday Wisdom today. Thank you so much, Roger, for being with us. We will put the link for the character course out there. It's really great to plug that great resource that there is for churches. And hopefully we'll be able to talk to you again soon.
That's lovely, Jason. And if anybody wants to read the Dunbar's number article, that's actually free online as well. So it's called Dunbar's Number Goes to Church. And you can just stick that into Google and you'll get it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Roger.